Hi, Misha here, and Merry Christmas, or should I say, Happy Jungle Carbine Christmas. Decided to do a more personal video, and one I just really felt like doing for the holidays. Let me know how you like this. It kind of just seems like the time to not focus on, commercials type stuff, and just to think about guns that are important to me and maybe you too. And so, we're going to talk about the Jungle Carbine, or if you prefer, the less fun term of Enfield No.5 Mark I. And I'm going to talk about the history and interesting little factoids, just, share things about it, but also give several little story times. And actually, my first Jungle Carbine directly relates to Christmas because it was a gift from my father many a moon ago. Also, back in the summer when I was kind of thinking of guns to move along to help finish out the cabin, I was really going through my guns that I had two of, thinking, okay, let's pick the favorite, let the other one go. Believe it or not, I don't actually have many duplicates of things. I just tend to have one of this type or that. And the Jungle Carbine was one. Well, rather two. But I just couldn't do it. So I still have two of these guys. But I'll explain why, and I think at the end you'll kind of at least agree or understand my reasonings. Hope everyone's having a good holiday season. Best wishes. Let me know what you're wanting or getting for Christmas. That'll be fun. Having to record this here at the house because on the actual day of Christmas we'll be too busy. But don't worry, plenty of cabin videos coming up for this holiday season. Don't you fear, including probably something special for New Year's. And before we get into Christmas, speaking of gift giving, I really do appreciate all the increased support ever since I put out that kind of call to action video in November. It's given new life and really helped a lot. And it's been mentally supporting too, as well as financially. Because even if I said I'll give you my free time, guess what? Other people like J-Row and Fox, their time is worth something, and I have to respect that. So, yeah. Plus, unfortunately, ammo manufacturers, gun makers won't give you stuff based on exposure. So it really does help. And if you'd like to help support us, check out Patreon. If you'd like to help every month, or if you just want to do a one-time donation, YouTube now does like the super thanks, and of course there are super chats during live streams, which we'll have a couple coming up once we get to the cabin and all that good fun stuff. Sorry for the background noise, but hopefully the Mac mitigates most of it. So with that plug out of the way, the No.5 Mark I Jungle Carbine. It's actually quite interesting that Enfield started making a carbine again. Britain had not really had a carbine for nearly 50 years. And that's because the SMLE was so successful. Going back to the days of the Lee Metford, it would take a few years. The long Lees, the Metford or Enfield, the rifling change, were, well, rather long, over 30-inch barrel, 50 inches overall, very standard for that day and time. Now, while some countries would immediately adopt a cavalry carbine, Britain would take a little while. In fact, the very first Lee Metford carbines did not appear until the end of 1894, by which time the Enfield was really kind of coming around. So the Lee Enfield carbine appeared as early as 1896. They are cool, but the Boer War happened 1898, 1899, and issues with the Enfield, especially vis-a-vis the Mauser, were really apparent. And after the war, they really evaluated, and then Britain leaped ahead by the end of 1902. Although there was controversy, they would switch out their carbine and long rifle technique for the SMLE. beginning with the Mark I in 1903, and then the very famous Mark III by 1907. This split the difference with the 25 and some change inch barrel, and would be what served them well. But this gun I'm holding here is a so-called New Zealand carbine. These actually date back to 1901. And what they essentially did, they plugged in a Martini Henry, or rather, to be exact, Mk.I Enfield 303 barrel to a carbine receiver, and they mounted a bayonet lug for the pattern 1888 blade bayonet. This barrel is a little bit heavier than the standard carbine barrel because the carbine barrel is cut back as much as it could be for weight savings, and even this version is very light and handy. Not much over 6 pounds, frankly. Barrel is about 19 inches long. Overall length is under 40 inches. 303, of course. Originally would make 1,000 of these for New Zealand, and then in 1903 they would make another 500. So only 1,500 of these New Zealands were made. I think that's pretty cool. Now these would be factory built, updated carbines. Again, primarily the difference being the bayonet. Being in the firearms business has taught me a lot, and still teaches me today, about how to be honest, how to deal with people, how to kind of learn the do's and don'ts of other people, because what might be acceptable to you or me might not be acceptable to other people, and vice versa. And that actually takes me back to the late 90s when I ran into a gun shop in Northwest Arkansas, the Ozark Armory, ran by Bill. He's long since retired, but he and I still stay in touch, and he's well, for anyone who knows. But he knew I liked Enfields, and in the summer or early fall of a year, he sold me a Irish constabulary carbine, the Rick. Now those are the ones that were updated between 1904 and 1914 to take the bayonet. Interestingly, while the New Zealand, they only made 1,500, and the Irish, they made over 11,000, for some reason the Irish tend to get more attention, probably just because of their connection to all that going on up there, and just knowledge. I was really appreciative. 700 was a good deal then. Not a screaming deal, but I'd say at that time they were worth 9 or 1,000, so a good buy. Months go by, and I need money for Christmas gifts. I'm not opposed to selling guns. I really am not. And I sold that Irish carbine when someone offered me $1,200. For whatever reason, that one I had just really appealed to them. Okay? I didn't think much of it. Good profit. And I knew I could probably get another one. And I didn't have any, real personal attachment. But I guess Bill did. I let it slip, I didn't know I shouldn't, that I had sold it. This was a few months after Christmas. I wasn't bragging. I didn't mention when I sold it for. I wasn't like, oh, I doubled my money. I just said, yeah, I had to let it go to cover Christmas gifts. What are you going to do? Probably I'd asked about another carbine around at that time, and he said, well, don't you have that one? He was upset with me. I could tell because he didn't say anything. You know what I mean? When someone's just a little mad at you, they'll yell at you. But if you really upset someone to the point they're kind of hurt, they get quiet. It took me a while to dig out of that hole. At first, it was pretty rough. I'm not selling you anything outside of my collection. You're just going to move it along. Okay? And then it kind of became a joke, and I knew I was okay. He's like, you're just going to sell this one, aren't you? No. And, but I learned my lesson. If it's something out of his collection that he's doing me, I should probably keep it. And if I do need to sell it, keep my trap shut. Although he has let go of a few more really interesting guns over the years that I do have, but once in a blue moon I will tease him about, hey, I sold that Winchester or that Colt. And at first I was getting his goat pretty good, but I think now he's caught on. But no, he's good people, and what allowed us to remain friends for a quarter century is we have very similar values. That's one of the interesting things about gun people. A lot of people think of us as kind of rough around the edges and coarse, and we really are. We're a little bit kind of gruff. A lot of people in the gun business are ex-military or police. But under that, I think a lot of people in the gun business and the gun world really do have big hearts. And emotions, and I've noticed that over the years. And that's what makes this job more than just about money and guns. So there's your first little story time here. And this was Britain's first carbine, or at least versions of it, but they never made very many because the short magazine came in and really dominated the field between World War I and the interwar period. However, World War II, as we kind of looked at in the last video, changed things with the WWII Enfield No.4 Mach 1. We just recently covered that, and I just grabbed this one, the 1943 in the store. This is an example piece. 303, same action, meant to be a little cheaper. But when they went from the SMLE Mark III, or even the Mark V trials gun, to this, they added a little length, not much more than an inch, really. But they did add a weight. The barrel's heavier, the forestock is heavier, even though it's more durable. The receiver's a little heavier because they kind of eliminated some machining cuts and steps and went to more squared off cuts. And oftentimes to me the wood just feels like a heavier type wood, but they also use different woods as we discussed. So they added some bulk and mass back. The gun went from 44, 45 inches overall. Again, the buttstocks are variable lengths on these, to around 46. And, creeping up on the weight to around 9 pounds. Like I said, the carbine was not much over 6. The SMLE could shrink close to 8, 8.5. This was bumping 9, give or take, exactly what wood was used and all that. Of course, it did have the dinky pig sticker bayonet, which is done to kind of try to save some weight and cost on the overall kit. And was, frankly, not a very popular implement in and of itself. But it worked. Now, of course, these did not go into full service and production until 1941. So the middle of the war, needs must, and the first couple of years were still pretty hard for Britain. 39 to 42 were desperate times. However, by 1943, things were starting to look up. They haven't turned the corner yet. That would happen about a year later. But they can at least see the light at the end of the tunnel. And for the first time in half a century, they are thinking, maybe we need a carbine. So the origins of today's carbine, they actually go back to the end of 1942 when the British Infantry Weapons Committee starts researching what they consider to be the No.4 lightened. So weight was their kind of primary concern, but also length. And then in 1943, they would test several elements and kind of work on a lot of prototypes and learn a lot of things. They learned, hey, if you lighten the Enfield too much, the current Mark 6 and soon to be Mark 7 ball ammo recoils quite a bit out of a shortened gun. I know this firsthand, going back to Storytime. After getting that one for Christmas years ago, I don't know what possessed me other than just being young in my probably early 20s. Decided it'd be really cool to show off to friends at the cabin and try to shoot one of these one-handed. Nothing bad happened, but I learned my lesson real good, and so did the British. Moving into 1944, after kind of going through a lot of experimentation, in March, specifically March 21, they finalized. But it's still called the No.4 lightened carbine at this point. It would not actually be until September 12 of that same year the designator of No.5 Mark I was given. The Jungle Carbine nickname would come later, although I say it's kind of well earned myself, but we'll get there. This was the pattern, and this is an early production example. And it has some early production wartime features. But yeah, going back to those lessons learned. That's why they essentially adapted the Bren light machine gun flash hider, because they learned that out of a short barrel, and this is about a 20.5-inch barrel, including the flash hider. If you don't count it, it's under 19 inches. Yeah, then they need something to tame that. And because of how light it was, without any ammo, without a sling, any kit on it, this is 7 pounds. So a little bit heavier than the previous carbine, not by much. And that's why we have this rubber butt pad. A quick side-by-side, number 4 on top, the New Zealand in the middle, and the jungle below. These two are essentially the exact same length. It might appear that the jungle's slightly shorter, but the truth is that this kind of gets down to buttstock length, and of course this having the slightly different barrel for the bayonet lug. This is a little bit lighter of a gun, but this is not much heavier. And even the number 4 isn't that much longer, about 4-5 inches at most. But really where it gets it's the weight. This is a 9-pound gun. So definitely the heaviest of the Enfield since at least the Longley. Overall length is under 40 inches. You can't exactly say, because one thing Britain did, they had different lengths of buttstock. 3 for this one, small, medium, large. Later on in different guns like the L1A1, they would introduce an extra long and even an extra short. That's because they had an empire. So, you know, different environments, different clothing, different body types. But they still thought that lefties were the spawn of Satan, so get right-handed. But they put a lot into this. You could tell that they were serious about it. They saved every possible amount of weight. They lightened the receiver, removing extra material, including that boss for the never used feed cutoff. As you see on this particular example, something I think is kind of cool about it, they cut out a big old chunk from the bolt knob to save probably about an ounce there. They went to a slimmer trigger guard, something that would also be carried over to some of the number 4 production. Obviously the furniture is cut back as much as possible and lightened, short upper handguard. Even the barrel band is a little bit thinner. And they even added lightning cuts to the barrel. Fortunately, checking the barrel for lightning cuts is very easy and only requires removing the screw for the front swivel and band. Then your handguard slides forward, and you can easily check them out here. One here, kind of a flat top, and one here. The barrel profile itself is also lighter. It has much more of a taper than the number 4. So while it starts off almost as heavy here, by the time it gets here, it's noticeably thinner. So once you know, it's kind of hard to fake a number 4 barrel to become a number 5. And again, ditto with the receiver, the way it's got extra lightning cuts on, frankly, both sides. Other things, they went to a side sling mount on the rear, which is just a fixed bar with an inlet in the stock for it. Although I think it's interesting that they still have the bottom mount up here. They still use the same 10-round box mag as the standard Enfield. Again, by this point they're not issuing 2. It's just really for cleaning, because these can be topped off by clips. Because of the shorter barrel and a shorter sight radius, the rear sight, while it was a micrometer, this is kind of the early return to the machine micrometer. It was only calibrated for between 200 and 800 yards. Not 1,200 or sometimes reported 1,300 on the long rifle. Obviously, like the original carbine, the front sight did have protectors. Everything was rounded off. I always thought these stocks kind of looked sporterized the way they were done, but if it works, it works. And this whole thing, it's essentially a cast assembly pinned onto the barrel, not screwed on. But one element of the number 4, even though it was light, had to go, was the pig sticker bayonet. For once, not worrying too much about weight and thinking about needs of the soldier, a whole new pattern of bayonet was introduced. The creatively named No. 5 Mark I, the Wilkinson bayonet, meant to be used as a combat knife, utility knife with a Bowie blade, about 8.5 inches. And this blade and this scabbard would move on to be highly influential, and aside from changing grips, would remain in service through the 1980s. In some ways, maybe more influential than the jungle itself. And it it's kind of, get it on here good. There we go. The ring is quite large to fit around that flash hider. I'm sure that was a little bit of a technical challenge, but they did it. And it's still not a very heavy implement. And since these were planned to be used by forward scouts, airborne, folks fighting in the jungles, what have you, yeah, having a kind of blade on them was, they were going to do it anyway, so might as well be able to attach the gun. And the mount is very secure. Obviously, your overall length isn't super great, under 50 inches, but I'm not going to say bayonets were never used. About the time you say that bayonets are obsolete, then there's a very famously publicized case of bayonets saving a group's life. So it's one of those tools that you really don't need at all, right up until you do. And it doesn't happen often, but if it saves lives, why not? Now, using it as a knife, that happens all the time. So they were smart, because that was the big deal with the pig sticker. This sucked. And a comparison with bayonets fixed, destroying the overall reach. You get a little more with the No. 4. But the utility of having an actual blade is definitely outweighing. And of course, eventually, the No. 9 would be made for the No. 4 anyway. So, yeah, try to line these up as best I could. Should also mention, they both used the same sling. A sling that would actually be carried over for the L1A1. And these are made at BSA's Shirley facility and for Zachary in Yorkshire. And while there would be some early kind of pre-production versions in 1944, full rate production was authorized in late summer of that year, and a handful were available in September with the beginning of Operation Market Garden, Arnhem in the Netherlands. So a handful of these are in pictures used there. And the primary user in the European theater would be the British 1st Airborne. They would use these throughout the liberation of the Netherlands. They would also use them in Norway and a few other places. But, you know, the war is coming to an end, especially on the ground, in 1945. So the European theater did not see a lot of use for the No. 5. Otherwise, we might not call this the Jungle Carbine. We might call it the, I don't know, Black Forest Carbine? I love Black Forest cake. So its life there is pretty brief. But that wasn't really where it was expected to serve anyway. In the Far East, against the Japanese, it would have a much more storied World War II history. This carbine's real life began in Burma By April of 1945, these were making their way over, new production, and Britain was shifting its focus to the Far East because obviously the war in Europe is winding down, soon to be over, and now everyone's going to focus on Japan, even Russia does. And so they are in the Burma campaign. They also were pretty much being handed out because of their compact size, lightweight. There were plans to mass produce these, issue these for retaking of places like the Singapore area, Java, even when they would launch the inevitable invasion of Japan. And this was going to be the new rifle for British troops in that environment. And at first, it was well received. Now, it's a bolt action. The Americans, the Yanks, have the M1 Garand and the M1 Carbine. You know, that sucks. But, you know, it's a bolt action. It's a lot lighter, fires a standard cartridge. By this point, the Mark 7 round is kind of taking over from the earlier war Mark 6. It's perfectly good jungle range. And the new bayonet is definitely well received. No bones about that one. And so everything is kind of up and going in 1945. But of course, like I said, the war ends, as you know. So the carbine becomes more of an occupation force gun. British troops serving in Japan and other areas would be issued these in 1945, 1946. They would also issue these in large numbers in Palestine in 1945 until the British would withdraw a couple of years later. They would even be used to put down an uprising or two in that general area. So a little bit of desert combat there. But of course, with the end of the war came budget cuts and some, kind of cold, hard reality. You can swap out guns to my post-war example here. This one is actually made here, you can see, by Fazakerley. And just to bring it back for a second, this one's also Fazakerley. I don't have a BSA, never have. Don't know. But production would continue, but at a slower pace. In fact, BSA would soon shut down not just jungle carbine production, but Enfield production after the war. But Fazakerley would continue, as we talked about in the No.5 Mark II video. So they would keep on cranking these out. In fact, there were big plans for these. They weren't just going to be made in UK. Canada had originally planned to start producing at least a version of this, the No.5 Mark I at Long Branch. But with the end of the war, those plans were shelved. Australia had an interesting relationship with this. And while they would never make a No.5, they would make the No.6 carbine. Not in big numbers, but it was heavily inspired by this gun. And while Ishapur in India and POF in Pakistan would never make the jungle carbine, the No.5, they would refurbish and use these in various numbers and types, so you can find some of these with marks from that area. And there were even plans to have a No.5 Mark II. But they never came to fruition because by 1946, issues were starting to appear. Yeah, troops like the size and the weight and the fact that it used a standard cartridge, but an issue known as Wandering Zero. Anyone who knows the jungle carbine thing knows that's a thing that always pops up. It appeared. There's a lot of debate even today about the validity of this, but it was certainly a thing. There are records from the time, and you could even see evidence in the change in production. With the original pattern here, we have the device pinned onto the barrel, and we have just the wood forearm cut back. Introduced in 1946 were a couple of updates, either to ease production or to help fix the Wandering Zero issue. They added this steel nose cap to the stock, which I think looks much more attractive. And they went to more of a press fit for the assembly on the barrel. They have hopefully more symmetrical mounting. Keep in mind too, these were made from the same basic wood types, kiln dried even, as the No. 4 Mark I. So they did have issues, especially with these being used in the jungle environments, Pacific environments. So yeah, this cap was also hoped to kind of stabilize the wood, maybe help with the Wandering Zero. But it was also speculated that maybe going to the thinner barrel with the lightning cuts was doing it. They never 100% ironed it out or even 100% proved it was a real thing. It's kind of like a gremlin in the design, but you can see some production differences in the post-war guns compared to the wartime. And a side-by-side with the 1944 on top and the 1947 on the bottom. One good thing about these both being out of Fasekkerly, you can really tell just the changes and lack thereof over the production run. Yeah, no real changes to the butt pad of note, or even really the receiver. Magazine is standard No. 4. Now, they all have to do with the barrel and forestock. With budget cuts and the problems with the gun and the fact that they're not really able to iron out the No. 5 Mark II, which was to feature actually the first Enfield with the trigger hung from the receiver, something later carried on to the No. 4 Mark II. And it was actually meant to have a stronger receiver and maybe barrel to launch rifle grenades, which is just a ridiculous sounding notion in and of itself. Yeah, the Mark II was first canceled in the early 47. And then in July of that year, the No. 5 Mark I itself was canceled. Now this gun here is dated 7 of 47, so that was the month it was canceled. But they actually would keep making these at Fasekkerly, kind of using up existing parts through about this. And the other side showing the difference in the lightning cut on the bolt knob. Receiver's pretty well the same. This one's a little bit more rounded on this side. This one's a little bit sharper edged. A metal finish would be phosphate, typically covered with paint. 1944 is right when they started going to a type of black paint finish, and of course with these expected to serve in humid, wet, salty climates, it probably would have been one of the first guns to get it. Makes perfect sense. As with the No. 4, serial numbers would start with a prefix. I believe this is still before they would switch over at Fasekkerly to the FP or PF, I should say, and of course much before the UF switch. And they don't have a lot of serialized parts. Receiver, bolt, usually the magazine, and usually the stock is matched. That's about it. You'd think the flash hider assembly might be, but I don't believe they were. Correct me if I'm wrong. Remember, I can't see, so it's all on memory. And I don't believe the bayonets were serial matched to their individual guns. They had their own system, as far as I remember. Although I do know Fasekkerly did mark some of their bayonets that shipped in the 50s with the No. 4, so maybe they did some of the jungles too, but I don't believe so. And the sling would carry on. Obviously, there's no storage compartment in the stock for a cleaning kit, so that would all be carried in the belt or backpack of the soldier. And finally, yes, these use standard Enfield stripper clips chargers that have been in use for decades upon decades. Now, the one we've looked at earlier, this is a pretty good example of an early production, 10 of 44. Again, full rate production really wasn't authorized until August of that year, so this is within a couple months of the beginning, and the other one is within a couple of months of the end, give or take. And that was kind of the problem when I went to see, hey, I don't need 2 jungles, do I? But then which one to sell? They both represent different eras. And this post-war version, most people want a wartime, but no, the post-war definitely saw some combat use, that's for sure. India and Pakistan would use them throughout the decades, frankly. And Australia and Canada would get some, especially during the Korean War. Yeah, these were definitely put into service in 1950. Even though production was over, they had them, and the British would use them themselves, especially special forces, communications troops, and share them with their Canadian brethren and Australians. The funny thing is, the Canadians quickly grew to hate this gun. The Australians, though, kind of liked it a lot, at least comparatively speaking. And they'd already had a little taste of it going back to around 1948 in Malaysia. These would be used for the Maori uprising there for about a decade by both British and Aussie troops. That would end around 57, 58. They would also be used in Africa by the British, in Kenya, for the Mama uprising in the 50s. Just as maybe influential, if not more, was the bayonet again, the Wilkinson bayonet. Between 44 and 45, Wilkinson themselves would make nearly 190,000 of these, more than the rifles. And then post-war, there were about 3 or 4 other makers, including Poole, who made the earliest number 9 bayonets. And I don't know exact numbers post-war made by other companies, but it seems to be 120, 130,000, which means that over 300,000, maybe 330,000 of these were made, more than the carbines by a good amount. To be fair, though, of course, these would also be used on the Sterling submachine gun. And Sterling themselves would even make a version of this in the 60s. So the end. Yeah, it was used in Malaysia, but that would end. Not much in the Middle East. India and Pakistan would knock them about for a bit. Australia, special forces would use them. Canada, no real interest. The last recorded use I could find, it was in 1967, when essentially the British were getting out of Yemen. There were a few knocking about by that point, but of course the L1A1 is premier at this point, the Sterling submachine gun, and that's really what happened. In the beginning, these served alongside the number 4, some Lend-Lease M1 carbines and M1 Grands, but of course, how long can a bolt action realistically hang on? 67 is pretty respectable, although the numbers were not big. And by that point, they're pretty worn out, because they only built about 251,000 of these. And so they got used a lot and recycled. So with that, let's talk about how they got in America and where the name Jungle Carbine actually came from. Santa Fe Arms. That's where the name Jungle Carbine came from. They imported the first batch of these to the U.S. in the 1950s. And they used it as a marketing thing. Yeah, back then, a lot of importers really hyped up things with kind of made-up names like Black Widow, the Grey Ghost P38s. Yeah, well, these were the Jungle Carbines, but it's pretty apt. That's where they were being used. Probably at that time, recently off the Malayan emergency. Yeah, made sense. Those would have been the first ones, and they were okay. Of course, that's before my time, believe it or not. In the 70s and 80s, though, places like Golden State and Navy Arms would sell Jungle Carbines, air quotes, but they were actually converted number 4s and even converted SMLE Mark IIIs. Now, it's pretty easy to spot a converted SMLE. Everything's wrong about it, frankly. Spotting a converted number 4 is a little more tricky, but once you know what to look for, like the different receiver cuts and pull off the handguard to look at your barrel. Those are the two things I check real quick. Plus, you know, just the dates. Typically, they're easy to spot. Just if you see one, stop. And of course, if it's not made by BSA or Fazakerly, you know right away it's wrong. And again, India and Pakistan never made these. Long Branch never made these. And the only carbines made by Lithgow in Australia were the number 6s, but those are very rare. Basically, if you're to the point where you're getting a number 6, you know what's up. Just be aware that there are some faked ones done in the 70s and 80s. But in the early 2000s, another batch was imported primarily by Century Arms, and these were guns that were kind of left over in Malaysia. And condition was pretty variable. They were used. They had character. And that actually gets me to the one I got as a Christmas gift 25 some years ago. I had kind of offhand mentioned to my dad that I wanted an Enfield. Believe it or not, at that time, before a lot of the mass imports and the internet, I would find Enfields, but they were usually sporterized guns. The 303 round, the Enfield was a pretty popular hunting rifle in my neck of the woods. And I just kept finding them that were hacked up. And I was like, man, I'd really like to find. So, bless him, he did order me an Enfield. Got it for Christmas that day, Christmas morning. And it was a jungle carbine. And I was a little disappointed. Because I wanted your basic SMLE Mark III, maybe a number 4, but really an SML Mark III. But these were coming in at that time. So they were kind of what was most available and, you know, just what was getting attention. But of course I was grateful for it. Being in college at the time, I was happy just to get what I could get. And if memory serves, they were about $150 then. Again, condition was a little variable. Some of them were a little worn out. Some of them looked okay. Some of them needed some TLC and they looked better. But because of that, I learned to love it. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, I had the gun, so I studied it. I shot it. And I realized, heck, only 250,000 of these were made over a 4-year run. That's pretty cool. And I realized, you know what? I can get a number 4 or even a Mark III anytime. But jungle carbines will kind of be here today, gone tomorrow. That was another early lesson in surplus for me. That one kind of unintentionally taught by my dad. You know, with just over 250,000 of these built, and since they started being imported way back in the 50s, and Century brought over quite a large number in the early 2000s, I wouldn't be surprised that all the surviving, or at least a vast majority of the surviving number 5s are in America today. Obviously, a lot would have been lost to attrition, just destroyed in combat, left behind, and turned into piles of scrap. But still yet, there are a pretty substantial number in this country compared to just how few were actually made. But, just, you know, early days. And that's the whole connection. When I pick up one of these, I think of that experience of shooting and not knowing not to do one-handed. Learning about how to do surplus, learning that if you get one that looks a little ratty in the box, you can clean it up. And of course, just being a gift. Now that said, that gun did have some issues. A broken part here or there. I'm trying to think what it was. Something ended up being broken on it, or broke when I was using it. And, you know, condition was in. And I'm not a very sentimental person when it comes to a lot of this stuff. So over the years, I've traded around and tried to get nicer examples. And ended up with these two. And I think I'm kind of where I'm going to be. They both have what I like. They both have both feature sets, early and late. Condition is good. Bores are good on them. Numbers match. Yeah, I couldn't bear to part with one. Plus, a few years back, I got my bayonet off a buddy. So I can't sell a gun that I've got a bayonet for, right? Man, these are cool. Be aware of what you're looking for. The pros and the cons of these. I wouldn't buy one as an everyday shooter. The rubber will be old. If you shoot it a lot, it'll probably crumble. I'm sure there is replacement rubber out there, but it is kind of riveted in. It's not designed to be a replaceable part. I always do this with these. Cool. But of course, this has the great action of an Enfield. Triggers are good on these, although not as good as a No. 4 Mark II. And I guess that's all I have to say about that. I appreciate you tuning in on YouTube here. There is a longer uncut version with a few bloopers that I posted a few days back on Patreon. So if you'd like to sign up over there, $1, $5, $10 a month. You can also be a member for free, although not really sure how that works. It's kind of a new feature Patreon's doing. But if you can't, I completely understand. But you can like, share, and subscribe, and you can share with your buddies. Or if you want to do a one-time donation, there are the super thanks. But no matter what, I sincerely hope happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and we'll do something for New Year's, and got a lot of new plans for 2025. But for this one, I just really felt like talking about a gun that was unique and special to me, with story times scattered throughout. What about you? Have you ever had a Christmas gun? Or just a gun that's special for other reasons? Let me know in the comments. Commenting also helps the video quite a bit. With that, this is Misha, wishing you a good rest of the year of 2024, and be here for 2025. And if you can support the channel in any way, that's great. Catch you very soon next time.